Everybody, please welcome the author with me. J Ryan Stradal is with us.
Hi.
Hi.
Welcome. This is
Hello.
Hi. Thanks to everyone for reading the book, for choosing it for your book club.
I think it was a fun one to read right now. Very,
cool.
very good. So thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate
you bet.
it. We're really excited. And I know a couple people have some questions here, but
good.
If you're willing, maybe you could start and just talk a little bit about yourself. And I know somebody was wondering if you are actually a chef yourself. So
no, I mean, I've worked at restaurants and for caterers, but I've never been a chef. My brother's been a chef. Until recently, he was a chef at a hotel restaurant in the cities. But yeah, not me. I had high school jobs in restaurants and worked for a caterer when I first moved to California. But I'm more of an enthusiastic end user of food than a creator of it. But I'm from southern Minnesota originally, from the southeastern town of Hastings. It's on the Wisconsin border, right across the Mississippi River from Prescott, Wisconsin. And both my parents went back to college when I was a kid at University of Wisconsin River Falls. And so I spent a lot of time in that area of Wisconsin, Hudson, River Falls, a little bit down to Eau Claire and Chippewa Falls. Yeah, I've actually never been to Door County. It was one of my mom's favorite places to go on vacation, but she only went with her girlfriend. She never took her kids. It was it was where she went on vacation to get away from us. Yeah, so
that's common.
yeah. And so, so I still haven't seen it yet. I was hoping to do some supper club research this spring because my third book is largely set in a supper club, and I know Door County and Washington County have a lot of them. And I would have loved to visit some in person. Maybe I still can, but Tracy's been kind enough to get me in touch with at least one supper club owner so far who I just sent an email to today. So that's my current book, is a book set mostly in a supper club. But yeah, I grew up in Minnesota, went to college in Illinois, and then ended up moving out to California after I graduated college to work in the TV industry. I had a interview offer from a former professor who was an executive at CBS, and I didn't get the job, but I was stuck out here. I'd moved out here thinking I'd get the job, and I ended up working at VH1, and then later on had a lengthy career in reality television because of where I started, because of starting at VH1. And Tracy, I saw that you shared my article I wrote for Vanity Fair about what I learned from reality television that I applied to novel writing. Yeah, I worked on shows like Deadliest Catch and Ice Road Truckers and Storage Wars, but I also worked on the first 2 seasons of The Bachelorette. Yeah. So yeah, pretty strange life experience, but I feel like I'm still a Midwesterner at heart. It's where I set all my books. I grew up reading books with my mom. Like, she and I kind of had a 2-person book club in our house, and boy, and at the time in the 80s, I felt like there weren't enough books set in Minnesota, and I really wanted to read more. And so it's been my goal in life to set books in the Midwest, in my home state, and in other states I grew up visiting, like Minnesota and South Dakota. I'm sorry, like Wisconsin and South Dakota and Illinois. And so every book I write will probably take place in that region, just because I feel like I can't get enough of it. I want more of those books to exist in the world, and more stories about the people I grew up around and grew up with to be in the world.
Do you make it back to the Midwest very often?
Oh, a lot. Yeah, usually 5 or 6 times a year.
Good.
I would have been there a few times already this year if it weren't for coronavirus. So, but that said, I'm going to come out as soon as I can. My publisher is already working on some book dates in July and August, and hopefully that can happen. We'll see if we're able to travel by then, but yeah, we're proceeding as if we might be able to. So yeah, I hope to make it back this year. I mean, I've also got a newborn son. He's about 3 months old, and he hasn't met his grandma yet, or his uncle, or his grandma and grandpa. And so I felt like, or his great grandma, he hasn't met his great grandma. Yeah, my grandma's 96. You know, she'd love to see him. She's not going to come here to see him.
No.
Not going to get on a plane. Certainly now either. So, yeah, we've got to take him out there to meet these relatives. And we were hoping to this June, but, aren't going to at the moment. So I definitely hope to come back some more.
Well, good. Well, we hope someday you'll get to Door County and maybe we can host you in person. Yeah, that would be great.
Oh, yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. What can you tell us about writing Kitchens of the Midwest?
Wow, I wrote that book while I was working on a show called Storage Wars, Texas. And I don't know if you've ever seen Storage Wars, Texas, but it's not an intellectually demanding show to watch or produce. And so I only had to work about 5 hours a day to edit that show. It's basically like editing a game show, the Storage Wars shows, because they don't shoot much more footage than they end up using. And well, and also know right away from the field which footage you're going to end up using based on the auctions that the participants you're following win. They don't keep any footage from ones they don't win. So you know right away what you're editing. So it was a very easy show to work on. So I had more time in the morning to write. And I came up with the idea for Kitchens in 2009, and I finally started writing in 2013. And in the meantime, I saved money every year to set aside to maybe take a year off to write a novel. But because Storage Wars, Texas was easy enough to work on, I started writing it already while working on Storage Wars, Texas. And when that show was not renewed for some reason, instead of going back to work, I used my savings and I kept writing. And I was able to finish that book in about a year, like a year and a day. And then I sent it to agents and got an agent. I had a few agents interested in it. I chose one. I chose a guy from Michigan originally. I met him in New York and flew out there and met with him, and he sold the book in about 8 days to my editor, Pam Dorman at Viking. Pam was one of a couple editors interested in the book, and I interviewed them and I asked them all, what is the book about? And I liked Pam's answer the best, which was, this is a family story, not a food story. And that was the crux of what I wanted to get at, was how Eva assembles this family of choice from the people that have touched her life over the years. Because she doesn't have the advantage of being born into a nuclear family. So she really has to figure that out for herself. And as she touches people with her food, they return this emotion and this connection. And by the end of the book, she has a pretty strong kind of ad hoc family unit. And that was a fun story to tell of how a person assembles this kind of tight-knit group. I remember being at a dinner party once, maybe around 2007 or 2008, and wondering, how did all these people meet the host? And that kind of became the genesis for the story of Kitchens of the Great Midwest, was starting at the dinner party and working backwards, explaining how all these people ended up there, at what point in their lives they met this person. But I also started with a menu and worked backwards, and I assigned each menu item to a different character, and had the characters tell the story of how they introduced that menu item to Eva one way or another. And as such, there were several menu items that I wrote chapters for that didn't end up making the final book. So yeah, there's some ingredients in the final menu that don't have chapters, or didn't have chapters make the final cut. But yeah, they were written. One of them ended up on the web, on the internet, as a short story, a chapter about early girl tomatoes, about this variety of tomatoes that are early growers. Yeah.
If that's still out there, you might have to share a link so we can read that later. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Maybe I'll post it on the book club site. Yeah.
That'd be great. I'm going to open it up to the questions. I'm going to start with Jane Whitney, because I think she had a good one. Jane, can you say your question?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, I can hear you, Jane. Thank you so much for coming here.
Oh, this is just great fun.
Great.
So you sort of answered it in some of your talk here about why you had Eva lose her family, essentially, through her dad through death, and then her mom leaving them. And I wonder if you just saw that as the impetus as to she would then have to form her own family. She was like doing a recipe, and she was missing ingredients.
Yeah, basically, yeah. The way I structured that book was a recipe for a human being. Like, each one of these people supplies of food and supplies a soul that makes her who she is. And so it's essentially a recipe for a person, in this case a recipe for Eva. So yeah, that's a great way of putting it. I really appreciate that question. Yeah, but that said, I did have to kill her parents or make them vanish. The Lars chapter I wrote last, and it was so hard to write because I love that guy, and I realized at a certain point, like, oh no, I have to kill him. Like, why did I do that? I felt like, oh boy, I really boxed myself into with this one. I mean, yeah, because I wrote the book out of order. I think the first chapter I wrote was, it might have been Venison, might have been the first one I wrote. I knew that was an earlier one. It was one of the first two. And then I wrote the one where Eva takes the pepper oil and gets back at those boys. That was one of the early ones too. And so I hopped around, but I saved the first chapter for last because, well, in my 20s, I wrote a novel that'll never see the light of day. And one of the problems I had with that novel was that I spent about half a year rewriting the first chapter, just trying to get it perfect before moving on to the next chapter. And I didn't want to do that again. I'd heard all these things that they tell writers about how, an agent might not read past the first chapter. Or when you send the book out into the world, you only send the first chapter, and if they like it, they'll ask for more. Which is generally true, but it made me really anxious and paranoid about the first chapter. So when I sat down to write Kitchens, I'm like, I'll save that first chapter for last. And then when I sat down to write it, I'm like, oh no, I've got to kill this lovely guy. Oh. Yeah, I've had some people tell me, like, I can't believe it, you killed the main character. And I thought, really? But certainly if you read that book, you wouldn't see it any other way. Because I wrote the book out of order, I never thought of Lars as the main character. I never thought he'd be perceived as such. But of course he would be, because you pick up this book, you're reading it, and it's from his point of view, and you just assume that this is going to sustain itself, right? Yeah, they're like, I'm going to keep hearing from Lars, and that's fine. He's a pleasant, funny, loving guy. Like, I could read a book from his point of view, and whoops, sorry. No. Yeah. Thanks for that question. Any other questions from anyone?
It's interesting that what you just said, because to me, all the other chapters were written such that we get to imagine what happens at the end of that chapter to those people. But to me, the first chapter was the only one where you found out what happened to
that's true.
Yeah.
That's very true. Yeah, the rest of them all end on a question. I love that. That was one of my favorite ways of structuring a novel, was to end each chapter like on a cliffhanger. And I think that carried over from my TV work. Was, you work on a show like Deadliest Catch or Ice Road Truckers, and you end every act before you cut to commercial on some moment of peril or some unanswered question. And so I think I learned that from that, applied that lesson. But with the first chapter, I didn't really have a choice. I was like, no, I really have to tell the reader what happened to Lars. I can't leave that up to their imagination. Otherwise, that'll drive them crazy.
Sheriff, I can have you had some good questions earlier. You want to ask one here?
Which one were you thinking of?
Well, that is up to you.
Okay. Well, I thought it was a bit odd that Eva didn't seem interested in finding out more about her parents. And I think she knew that Fiona and Laura's brother weren't her parents. Like, she saw a birth certificate at some point.
Yeah.
And Brock's
she was
parents
in early
must
teens.
have known, but everybody was just like sealed to secrecy, and Eva wasn't curious about why she was the way she was.
Well, from my point of view, Eva had parents. Like, she still felt that Jarl and Fiona were parents to her, even if they weren't biological parents. And I think she was satisfied with that, feeling like, I have a dad and a mom. They may not be the people that gave birth to me, but I mean, particularly when she got the sense that her birth mom left, I think Eva was the sort of personality that felt like, if she wants nothing to do with me, I want nothing to do with her. I think she kind of felt like that early on, and that she kind of built a wall up about that, which is why she reacted the way she did at the end about I think kind of realizing, that this person was her mom, but kind of keeping her at arm's length, kind of like not directly interacting with her at all, always sending Randy or some other intermediary to deal with her. Yeah, and just sort of like keeping her defenses up because, she was abandoned by this person and doesn't really owe this person anything. But at the same time, I think she probably will develop that curiosity, now that the way Cindy puts it at the end is sort of like leaving the door open for Eva to make the first move, which I think is a wise and mature move on Cindy's part. Really the first unselfish thing she does in the entire book. It's at the very end when she's like, oh, wait a second, it's not really up to me to initiate this relationship. Should really be up to her. I'm going to back off. Like, she can come to me if she wants to. And and I think Eva might eventually, Well,
I had one other question about, are you thinking that Lars' tasting genes could actually be inherited by Eva?
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah.
Lots of other things are, yeah. Why not? Yeah, it could be, yeah. Or at the very least, a love for food too. Just having that, in your bones, in your blood, just this, just being drawn to it, being drawn to a life of service via food. I think that's something that, can be passed down between generations. I was just watching this documentary called Old Fashioned, the movie about supper clubs in Wisconsin. And one of the things about, one of the things that sustains supper clubs is the fact that generally families pass them from generation to generation, or try to anyway. And I think like you grow up in an environment like that, you kind of want to keep it going. And even though Eva never really knew Lars except as a baby, I think, I don't know, I was trying to say it, describe some sort of nature versus nurture thing in Eva's case, and being like, in this case, the nature wins out. In this case, yeah.
Did you know about, can I ask one more question, please?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. How many people do you think know about Scoville units?
Oh, I think an increasing amount, because...
Does everybody know about Scoville units?
Yeah.
I didn't know much about, I'd only heard about them. I didn't know much about like the rating system until I was researching the book. I mean, I grew up in a house where the spice was butter.
Really?
I'm still not super into really spicy food. I'm not one of those people that's like, I'll dare you to have the California Reaper. Like, no, I'll stick to Tabasco. I'm not into spicy food myself, but I had to research it for that role, and I thought, oh yeah, I got to get into that Scoville unit thing and figure it out, and also figure out what's tolerable and like what would actually
kill a person.
What could she grow in her closet hydroponically, and why. I got that idea from a friend of mine from Minnesota who was growing hot peppers in a similar situation. Not in his closet. He was doing it in his living room, actually. Growing them under these heat lamps, because where he was living, it was too cold to grow them outside, or it just wasn't hot and dry enough in the summer. I mean, even like still have a lot of friends and relatives, like my dad and my uncles try to grow like serrano peppers, serrano chilies in their gardens, and a lot of years it just doesn't work out. It's not dry enough. Yeah, right.
Yeah. All right. Thanks.
Yeah.
Who else has a question?
I had a couple, unless somebody else wants to go first.
Go ahead, Jane.
So how did you come up with the menu? I mean, you're a Midwestern guy, and those are pretty fancy dishes. So how did you get that all together?
Well, I worked with a chef who I used to work for, a woman named Patty Clark, who I thanked in the acknowledgments. She's a professional caterer, and now she works as a private chef. And I told her, I said, well, these are the sort of elements I want in this meal. Can you help me devise a menu giving these ingredients? And And that final
Wow.
menu is largely based on what she came up with. It's about
Wow.
70 or 80% a menu that she devised. Yeah.
Did she make some of it or all of it?
She hasn't, because she's a vegetarian herself, but other people have. It's funny. I've been to 2 or 3 dinners over the years where people attempted to replicate that meal. Yeah, it's pretty wild. Yeah, it blows me away. I've never done it myself.
The ones
I mean,
you
those
attended,
ingredients
did
are
they?
a lot of those ingredients are pretty hard to get out of season or out of the region. You know, in Southern California, I couldn't find venison if my life depended on it. And even sweet corn is a little hard to come by sometimes. Certainly things like rhubarb you're not going to get here either. So yeah, I feel like it's a real local menu, but that's the point. You know, that's the point. It was very much of its time and very much of its place. And thankfully, Patty was up to the challenge. I've thanked her in all of my books so far, actually. At some point or another, she's come through and had to help me with some food-related issue in every single one of my books, including the one I'm writing now. Yeah.
Thanks. And the only other comment I had was, in thinking about what this book was about, like you said, and I came in late to the Zoom part, but as you said, it's really about families and relationships, and not so much, not as much about food necessarily. But I really kept being struck by all the mothers, the mother-child relationships in the book. I thought that was really interesting.
Oh, thank you.
I like those.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah. There's a lot more of them in the book I'm writing right now, too.
Well, we'll read it.
Oh, thanks.
In between what you're writing now and the one we've just read, you had a book come out last year. What can you tell us about that?
Oh, yeah, The Lager Queen of Minnesota.
Yeah.
It's a book set within the beer history of the Northern Midwest, and it tells the story of multiple generations in a beer brewing family. But at the very beginning, it tells the story of 2 sisters who are divided over an unfairly divided farmland inheritance, which is, based on real life in my family on both sides. Yeah. There are people who still aren't talking to each other because of how they perceived the inheritance to be divided. And so, it starts with 2 sisters, one of whom gets everything and the other gets nothing. And I tell the story from both perspectives, and eventually the perspective of one of their granddaughters when she becomes a teenager and moves in with her grandmother. And these 3 women tell the story of how this family reunites, how these sisters eventually find a road towards reconciliation. But in the meantime, one of the sisters creates a brewery in Minnesota that becomes a hit for its light beer. And I follow the course of beer brewing and beer history all the way up through today. The granddaughter, Diana, also gets involved in the beer industry as an IPA brewer at a contemporary craft brewery. So, I take it all the way from the 1950s to today in terms of beer history. And man, that was some hard research, you know. I traveled around the country and I visited a little over 3 dozen breweries and had to drink beer at all of them. Yeah.
Real sacrifice.
Yeah. But it was really wonderful to tell the story of these women in the brewing industry, and also to, in one of the final chapters, tell a story of a really unlikely group of grandmothers that come to the aid of the granddaughter to help her out at her brewery and end up running it for a while. Yeah, it was really fun to tell a story that was inspired by the women in my life who are still working into their 60s, 70s, and 80s. And
has now gone on since that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, someone's TV just came on. All right. All right. It just got thrown off there for a second. But yeah, it was really fun to tell that story because
Yes.
you know, I want to see more stories about the kinds of people I grew up with out in the world. And this was one way of doing that.
All right.
Okay, go ahead, Cheryl.
Go ahead, Jane.
Okay, I had a question. I think these have, the themes are of universal content, but they are clearly so set in the Midwest. Do you find as you travel around the country that different sections of the country, different people, regional, react differently to your stories? Did the Midwesterners see it differently, say, from the New Yorkers?
I think so, yeah. Yeah. Well, for starters, a lot of the people in New York and Boston and San Francisco ask me, are there really people like this? You know, like Pat Prager, like, is she real? Yeah. But the funny thing about characters like Pat Prager is I've met a lot of people who say, I know Pat Prager. I've never met anyone who says, I am Pat Prager, you know? But yeah, no, there's a lot of readers I've met who really appreciate these stories. I mean, as a representation of maybe a part of the country they haven't visited, or they've only seen on the news, only seen represented in really stark ways, you know. Yeah, only see it on a map during election time or something. And I feel like, oh no, there's a very sophisticated and nuanced group of people in these states, and I want to tell those stories. And one of the things that also comes about when I'm on my book tour on the East Coast or West Coast is that the Midwesterners show up. The people that are from Wisconsin, Illinois, and Michigan, and Minnesota, and Iowa, they come to my events. You know, they're like, oh, great, we just wanted to come and say we appreciate someone writing about the Midwest. And I go, oh, that's great. Yeah. Because I always did as a young reader growing up in Minnesota. I got so tired of reading books set in California or the South or New England or New York City. And I was just like, you know, other than people like, you know, John Hassler, you know, or Faith Sullivan or Louise Erdrich, I didn't come across a lot of writers who wrote about my home state. So yeah, I still see a lot of people who go out of their way to tell me they appreciate that aspect of it. That means a lot to me.
All right, I think we have time for maybe one more question. Anybody
Okay,
have
cool.
something they'd like to ask?
Awesome, thanks.
How did you enjoy Northwestern?
Oh, it was great. Yeah, it was the big city for me. I mean, I grew up in Hastings, Minnesota, which was, you know, 15,000 people at the time. Not super small, but small compared to Chicago. And I went there and, boy, it just blew me away. Yeah, it was pretty intimidating at first, but I ended up being the same kind of nerd I was in high school. I joined everything. I became the general manager of the radio station and the Friday editor of the newspaper. And yeah, I joined a band just like I did in high school and did all this crazy stuff and ended up having a really good time. But yeah, it was a little weird at first because I'd never really been around rich people before. I mean, like people like that level of rich who go to private colleges like that. I mean, sure, there was like a rich guy in Hastings who drove a Porsche, but you know, lived in a house not, you know, that was, yeah, it was just like that was just like regular rich. Like going to Northwestern, all of a sudden I was around wealthy people. I was around like this guy named Jordan Neiman, who was the heir to the Neiman Marcus empire, or like Jill Eisenhower, who is the great granddaughter of Dwight David Eisenhower and granddaughter of Richard Nixon. You know, I'm like, God, you know, I never would have met these people otherwise. But that said, I mean, made a lot of friends and learned how to write short stories. And I didn't major in fiction. I didn't major in writing there at the time. I was too chicken. I thought prose was too hard. So I majored in radio, TV, film production, which, you know, I did end up doing for work for about 15 years. In audio production, I thought I was going to become an audio engineer, be a sound guy. You know, I did a lot of that work there. And so, yeah, it was neat. It was a real mind expanding environment. But still the Midwest, you know, still you go 20 miles in any direction from Evanston, Illinois, and you're in an environment very much like the one I grew up in.
Yeah. Well, we enjoyed reading about the places that you had walked down the street and all those different things. So that was fun for us.
Oh, yeah. And I got to describe a lot of aspects of my Northwestern experience too, like the Shakespeare Garden and the Burger King that was across the street from my dorm. And it was a lot of fun to go back there and think about it in terms of how would this character perceive this environment? different than I perceived it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Put
yeah.
myself in her shoes. Yeah.
Good.
All right. Well, thanks so much, everyone. My God,
Oh,
thanks so much for
this
reading the
was
book and
wonderful.
taking the
Thank
time out of
you.
your evening
Thank
to
you. Thank you.
talk
Very
about it.
exciting.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to your next book when it comes out, and reading the Logger Queen of Minnesota too.
Yeah.
So
All right. Thanks so
All right.
much.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Okay.
Tracy.
Bye.
Yep. Good night.